are the brutes in the pictures or whatever. That's the bottom of page 2, and then we'll go talk about the women. Now, as a way to get people to buy what are called Liberty bonds, which are basically loans by citizens to the government, we really had to whip up anti-German hysteria. We had to scare the bejesus out of a lot of these people. In fact, afterwards, you saw lots of little bejesuses running around. And so anyway, y'all, this is the brute that is supposed to represent the Germans. Look at his mustache. And I just noticed this, y'all. I've looked at this picture for years, and I just noticed this. What's up? That's a mustache on an ape. Who had a turned up mustache like that? The German Kaiser, right? The Kaiser had that big mustache. And you've got the pointy Pickelhaube helmet. You see the fangs. You see everything like that, right? I mean, he's obviously insane. Now, the Hun, okay, on the other picture is supposed to be the Germans. And I discussed that picture, y'all, with the German, with the blood dripping from his bayonet, with the church destroyed behind him. That's also portrayed on the left of your notes. But on the right, so who are the brutes in this? The Germans. They are literally being portrayed as animals. I mean, look at those eyes. Look at the saliva or spit dripping from his mouth there. Okay, pretty frightening. Okay, now, if you look here in the background, what do you think that's supposed to represent? That's like a burned out town. And if you look at these little nave-shaped things, who tends to have, what kind of structure tends to have these things? Churches. Very good. Churches have these, right? So these Germans, y'all, have destroyed churches. They've leveled all of that, of this town. And there were indeed towns that have been leveled by the Germans in World War I. Now let's zoom in here, and we're gonna look at the culture thing. But for years, y'all, Americans had assumed that the oceans would protect us from any attack, right? We had the Atlantic and we had the Pacific. But look at where this gorilla has landed. Look at his feet. What's underneath his feet? America. He has crossed the ocean. Now let's zoom in on that club of his, and that club says Kultur. What do you think that word is in German? Culture, exactly. Now Germans, y'all, were supposed to be the most cultured people in the world. You know, they had Beethoven, they had Bach, they had Goethe, the great writer. Germans were famous for their culture. So what is the sort of point of view? What is this guy suggesting about true German culture? It's violent. It's barbaric. I mean, if you look at this club, y'all, I mean, it's gross. I mean, there's like blood and brains and stuff all over that flesh. I mean, this guy has obviously beaten somebody. Look at his hands here, or paws, I guess, since it's an ape. It's almost like paws here. They're bloody, okay? And I won't zoom in on the lady because, you know, she's having a wardrobe malfunction, so to speak. But this woman, y'all, is supposed to represent like American womanhood, right? It's supposed to show what this guy's going to do. Obviously, he probably has some pretty bad intentions with this American woman, right? Now, particularly, what group of Americans do you think is the audience for this? Men. Why do you say men? Men who can go to war, and men feel an obligation to protect the ladies, right? So it's really meant to fire up the men, get them to enlist. Notice, this is the purpose of this, to enlist. You know, we need you men to do this, or these beasts are coming over here. They're crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and they're going to take our women, just like this brute did, okay? And they even have the address that you can go to sign up for the army there. But very, very powerful propaganda. And remember, propaganda has to have some basis in truth, or it's not going to work. Germans had destroyed cities. Terrible things had happened to some of the French and Belgian women, okay? And of course, they used the whole German culture against the Germans by portraying them as really the opposite of culture, of these brutish people. Okay, so we're going to go to now talking about the home front during World War I. AP loves to ask about this during wars. You're likely to see it during the Civil War, even some questions in the American Revolution, but definitely during World War I and World War II. So what's happening back home? You know, the people that aren't fighting, we call that the home front. Now, AP loves to ask about the ladies, about women's role in the war. Now, over time, women have been getting more and more involved in war. Going back to the Revolution, mostly women stayed home. There were famous women like Deborah Sampson who dressed up as a man and served. But the main thing women did during during the Revolution and even during the Civil War to a large extent was their traditional jobs as wives and as mothers. But of course, if their husband or their father ran a business or maybe ran a farm, they also had to do double duty and do that. But a higher percentage than ever, y'all, were women who went to work in the war factories, particularly making ammunition, as you see here with this lady. Notice what it says here. On her, their lives depend. And who are they? The artillerymen. Remember, World War I, y'all, was largely an artillery war. You know, we all know about the trenches and stuff, but more people were killed and wounded by artillery. I mean, the number of rounds fired, y'all, is crazy. And believe it or not, you can still find those artillery shells in some of those fields. They call it the iron harvest. Every year or so, when Frenchmen and Belgians go out to plow their fields, there will be some incident of some farmer finding some unexploded ordnance. And they let them know it's picked up, or sometimes they just move it off to the side. When I was in Belgium, we actually saw some places where just some unexploded shells, 100 years old, were kind of left there to be picked up by the engineers. And every now and then, one of them goes off and kills some people. Casualties in the war, just 110 years or so later, okay, or 105 years later. So the biggest contribution of women in World War I, much like it's going to be in World War II with the famous Rosie the Riveter, is going to be women take the jobs in the factories so that men can go overseas and fight, right? If you free up a woman, it means a man can go fight. Question, Robert?
How do you pretty sure can they still set off like now? Because I remember
some of them still can, yeah.
In the Civil War, the Civil War in El Salvador, there was a mine on the hill, and it went off and it blew this girl's full leg off.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, mines are one of the nastiest things around, and yeah, they can lay dormant for 10, 20, 30 years or so. In fact, after World War I, several years had passed, and they had put a bunch of explosives underground, because one of the things that they developed during World War I, y'all, was to dig basically tunnels underneath the enemy's trenches. You would fill it with explosives and then blow up their trenches. Well, they did about 12 or 13 of these at the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, and most of them went off, but 2 did not. 1 still is under there and has not gone off. But many years later, there was a lightning strike and suddenly a massive explosion in Passchendaele. And what was it? Lightning had found and detonated those explosives. So yeah, it's still a deadly thing. So you can imagine how deadly it was for these women working. There were accidents. Women got killed in these factories. So it wasn't just a riskless kind of thing to do. Now, if we look at the factories here, you can see that most of them depended on natural lighting. That's why, of course, y'all, daylight savings time was created to make sure workers were in the factories when there was light outside. It wasn't about you and me having light when we went home or while we're driving. It's about making sure there was light for the factory workers. And then we look here at these ladies. Now, there's an interesting result of these women working in these factories. Now, these women are actually kind of wearing kind of smocks or something like that, which they needed to do to protect them. But because of the war, we needed to save material to make uniforms. And women before y'all, the amount of clothes they wore could be measured in like square yards. Okay, it was like ridiculous amount of dresses and underdresses and petticoats, corsets and stuff like that. But to save fabric during the war, women's clothes start getting thinner and there's fewer of them. Another thing happens, particularly after World War I and then going into World War II, and hemlines start going up. If you look really carefully, you can see some ankle there, buddy. Yeah. And the other thing is, to keep their hair from getting caught in the machinery, what did women start doing? Putting it up, or even cutting it. And the flapper, which is this image of the 1920s, we'll talk about the flapper girls, is going to be a product, y'all, of women working in the factories, having light clothes that were much more revealing than the clothes had been during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but also with the haircut named for Mr. D, the bob. Okay, because I love bob haircuts. And anyway, but so we see them there. Notice if you look back here, that looks like a man is the supervisor, but it's largely women working in these factories. And as they fill the shells up, or is there, I don't know what they're doing exactly, but obviously they're going to put the shells in these shell cases. Now, this is a somewhat shocking picture to see women literally being beasts of burden, toiling in the fields. Well, why don't they have horses or mules or oxen doing that, y'all?
Because they didn't have
They didn't have them though. Why, Robert?
because they're in a different country.
They're over fighting in Europe, right? Have you guys ever seen the movie War Horse? It's an awesome movie if you ever get a chance. If you're ever too happy, just watch War Horse and it'll bring you back down. Okay. And so these women, y'all, they're working in the fields. They're doing whatever it takes. That's a pretty shocking picture.
When the U.S. ended the war, countries suddenly needed large numbers of women.
Now, the biggest contribution of women is going to be as nurses, though, besides working in the factories.
Women needed nurses, translators,
They worked as translators, secretaries.
lining army uniforms called the thousands of seamstresses. Women enrolled in the Army, Navy, and even the Marine. Nurses volunteered in British YMCA. Sources report nearly 20,000 Red-Cross nurses served with the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, half of them overseas. Female Salvation Army volunteers worked as nurses, and at frontline canteens serving hot meals, donuts, and coffee to soldiers. Ordinary girls in towns all over America suddenly had a chance at a different life, prospect, traveling to Europe to be an important part of the war. Among the thousands of women volunteering in France were many daughters of privilege, daughters of the wealthy society class, girls in elite women's institutions like Smith College often volunteered together. Newspapers like Stars and Stripes played up the society girls with old headlines. Paris Scrubs toast to AUS. February 1918 headline read, Society girl wheels brush and soap as a war weapon. The newspaper stories about rich girl volunteers were propaganda, sure, also true. They weren't allowed to fight like their brothers in the Lafayette Escadrille.
What was that? Air Squadron.
An Army head nurse wrote, some of the most conscientious and hardest workers in my youth are girls who had done nothing all their lives but fritter away their time in society. The war woke them up. They were girls of good education. They had never thought much about the stern realities of life until America got into the war and they suddenly saw a chance to do something useful.
So that was one big thing. Now, I didn't put it on the notes, but you should write somewhere too, that this was one reason that President Wilson ultimately became a supporter of women's suffrage, because he saw the great role that they had played in victory. He'd been opposed for most of his life, y'all, to women having the right to vote. But having seen what they accomplished, what they did, proved to be the thing that finally wins women the right to vote. When he put his support, threw his support behind it, it meant a great deal. So in some ways you could say women earned that by their sacrifices during the war. Now, as you saw in the video, women were, of course, very, very important as most, right, from Animaniacs. And also, women played a big role as ambulance drivers. Of course, they weren't the only people being ambulance drivers. As you guys remember, when I was talking about Armistice Day back in November, you had people like the great writer Ernest Hemingway, who had served as an ambulance driver. And we even had people like this guy, Walt Disney, all right? Before he became a castle, he was actually an ambulance driver. And people noticed that this guy loved to sketch drawings and put things all over the place, like this little sketch of a soldier on the side of his particular ambulance. These were Americans, y'all, that volunteered even before we officially entered the war. Much like, you know, some Americans today might feel like they need to go help the Ukraine, right? Or do volunteer work to help Ukrainians. You had that same kind of sensation or feeling. And when you think about it, you know, the common things that we had with England, the tongue, the language, you know, the common tongue and all that kind of stuff, the French having helped us in the revolution, a lot of Americans felt that they really owed it to France to do this. And there is that picture again. All right, so when we look at this cartoon as well, too, y'all, a similar one, the Germans are portrayed as basically guerrillas, much like that previous picture showed them as this some lower than human form. So it says, destroy this mad brute. Now remember, for documents to get your sourcing points, y'all, you guys need to either talk about the context, you could talk about the atrocities, for example, that led to this or whatever. You need to talk about the, or you could talk about the author, the intended audience. We'll talk about that in just a sec. The purpose, remember purpose and the audience often go together. Or you could talk about the point of view. What does this person believe? Where are they coming from? Okay, so let's look at this cartoon in some detail. And when you guys are, if you do, usually get at least one picture in your DVQs, you know, tear it apart. You can't cut it up like I do, but you can definitely zoom in your own mind and look at stuff. So when we look at this guy's face, right, obviously he's a brute. He represents the Germans as well, German militarism. He's got the pickelhaube with the spiked helmet. Anytime you see that, y'all, dead giveaway that it's the Germans in World War I. Now, the beauty of teaching this class is as long as I have since the last millennium is that I notice different things on pictures that I'd never noticed it before. I didn't notice really until this year, literally the drops of spit coming off the guy. I mean, obviously you see the fangs, but he's got spit, you know, saliva dripping from him like some wild, rabid beast. But this is what I just noticed last period. What is this, y'all, on his face? He's got a mustache. Who else had a mustache like that? The Kaiser of Germany. So he is literally, the Kaiser, y'all, is being portrayed as a brute. Okay, now we zoom in here too, y'all, and we see that same image of a destroyed city. And particularly, what kind of building do you think this could be? It's a church. And if you're not sure, look at the little kind of curved arches here, are the pointed Gothic arches that you see on a lot of your European churches. And people back then would have been able to recognize that as probably a destroyed church. Now, Americans, y'all, had always felt safe from European affairs because there was this big Atlantic Ocean on one side and a larger Pacific Ocean on the other side. All we had to worry about, y'all, was Canada and Mexico. Not really big threats, right? But if you notice something here, look at where this gorilla, this mad brute is. Where is he? He's in America. He has crossed that ocean. No longer are you and I safe because of the ocean. This brute has come here. And let's look at his club that he's got there. His club says culture on it. Culture. What do you think that means in English? Culture, right? Now, that is meant as an ironic kind of statement, right? This is something that definitely points out the point of view of this particular artist who did this. You know, whereas Germans were believed to be, and this is before World War II, right? The Holocaust, the terrible thing that the Germans have done in World War II are still in the future. But still, what they've done in Belgium, what they've done in northern France, y'all, is enough to make their claim to being a cultured people a complete lie. Look at the end of this club, y'all. It is literally with blood, brains, flesh all over it. Look at the guy's hands, or paws might be a better word for it since he's a brute. They're bloody too, okay? Kind of picking up where that other guy left off, although at least the other guy had a rifle with a bayonet. This guy is using just plain brute force, and he's coming to you. Now, a way to maybe anticipate who he's particularly targeting. He's trying, the purpose, y'all, of this is to do what? Get American men to enlist, to join the U.S. Army. But particularly, he's appealing to a particular group of men, okay? Because obviously, and I'm not going to zoom in on the lady since she's having a wardrobe malfunction here in this picture. But this lady, y'all, obviously is probably about to be raped if she hasn't been. She's going to be molested by this brute. And they're really trying to appeal to your manly virtues. If you're a guy, they're basically saying, join or else. What? Your sister, your mother, your wife, your girlfriend could be the next victim of this awful guy. And you see her just going, oh no, right? And he's got his bloody paws all over her. So quite shocking, but probably very effective. You know, hey, if you're not joining, you're helping these people maybe come over here and take our women. So it's a very, very useful cartoon, I think, or poster. All right, so now, y'all, we move to talk about the home front. AP in every war loves to ask about how did this war impact the people back home, what we call the home front. Now, women are one of the favorite groups. Remember, one way to get complexity points, y'all, is to really narrow down your focus, or you can talk about generalities, but mention, okay, so how did this event impact women? Did it impact them differently, or in a very different manner? And the impact, was it more, or how did it impact different ethnic groups, or how did it impact different parts of the country or different sections? If you can explain that in your essays, whether DBQs or LEQs, they love that stuff. So they like to ask about the impact of the war on women. Now, ever since the American Revolution going into the Civil War, for the most part, women stayed home during the war, right? They had the traditional jobs of women to take care of the family, take care of the kids, be good wives. And if the family had a business, if the family had a farm, that was their job to keep that running. And indeed, that's what most wives did during World War I. But if you go back to even the Civil War, we began to start seeing women working in the war factories. Now, this is actually a British poster, but it's of course encouraging women to work on artillery. Now, you guys saw the movie Lost Battalion, and you saw the terrible trench fighting and everything like that. But World War I was mainly an artillery war. More people died, y'all, as a result of artillery blast than anything else. So notice it's saying here, on her, their lives depend. In other words, she better do her job. These women munition workers. And this could be quite a deadly job, y'all, because these shells could explode. The biggest thing that women did during the war and World War II, y'all, with Rosie the Riveter, remember the "we can do it" thing that we saw at the beginning of the school year? A big thing, y'all, was for women to work in the factories, and that way men would be freed up to go serve in combat. Up to this point, y'all, I mean, really up until y'all's lifetime, women were not allowed to serve in combat. There were beliefs that the women were not physically able to do it. There was also the fear that what would happen to a woman if she got captured, right? There was this fear of her being sexually mistreated and all kinds of things like that. During Desert Storm in 1991, we let women fly in combat for the first time. And one woman pilot got shot down and was captured, and a lot of people were very upset and worried about what was happening. I know it sounds sexist, but that's how people viewed it. But today, women can serve in combat in most fields, and that's only changed in y'all's lifetime. So what could women do? Well, they could work in the factory. Some women served as translators. Some women served as stenographers, or basically secretaries, to write down stuff, speeches and letters, and then type them up. Women served as phone operators and did that. But as you'll see in this video, perhaps one of the biggest contributions of women were working as nurses. Women also, y'all, had to keep the farms going, and this could be particularly difficult, in some of the others, in the circumstances I'll show you. Now, this is what a war factory would have looked like. You can see it's almost all women on the floor there. Occasionally, you'll see a man, and notice, y'all, the men are in what role? They're watching them. They're the overseers. They're the bosses. And it's ironic, y'all, my neighbor who's catty corner from me, he's like 98 years old, okay? And during the war, he lived in Chicago, and he worked in a factory that employed women. And his job was basically to be their boss, to monitor their work, and that's what he did for most of the war until the end when he went and served. So it's kind of interesting how it's men being the overseers, but it's women doing the work. You can also see that they're using a lot of natural light. And this is the reason, y'all, we went to daylight savings time. Not so you and I would save daylight for when we got home. The idea was get the workers in the factory when the sun first comes up so that we can maximize the number of hours that they have light, which will make it easier and better for them to do it. Now, another interesting thing comes out of the war, and that is the ideal woman. Now, pretty much, y'all, since America's founding, men's idea, and perhaps women, if they wanted to please men, their idea of the perfect woman had been a woman with long hair, often piled up on her head like a little hair helmet, wearing tremendous amounts of clothes, right? Having a dress, a petticoat underneath it, a corset, lots and lots of fabric. I mean, you could actually measure the fabric in square yards that these poor ladies had. But because of the war effort, the desire to save on material, and this is duplicated again during World War II, y'all, the dresses start getting lighter. The dresses start getting shorter. Like if you look on this lady here, you could see her ankles. Believe it or not, you wouldn't even have been able to see the ankles before the war. And by the time the 20s come around, y'all, you're going to see a lot more. I mean, you're going to be able to see knees and stuff like that. The other thing, too, women's hairstyles change. Women start getting shorter hair because they had to cut it to work in the factory, because you don't want that hair to fall into the machinery or to get caught in the machinery and maybe tear your scalp off. So there's all kinds of interesting consequences. Now, these women are filling up shells. These are shells here that they will fill up with explosives. They look kind of like maybe an 18-pounder or something like that. And of course, after filling them, they'll fill them up in these boxes. Here it looks like you have a man back here once again, overseeing these women workers. Can't imagine that kind of job. It'd be awfully dangerous to do what those ladies are doing, but that was a role. Now, in the fields, on the farm, women had to do the job of not just men, but as this picture suggests, sometimes even farm animals. Because if you look at England and France, a lot of the farm animals, y'all, were drafted too, right? If you've ever got a chance, y'all, to see the movie War Horse, War Horse really does a great job showing you the role that animals played in the war. If I ever get too happy, I'll just put War Horse on to bring me back down sometimes. You know, because it's pretty sad seeing what the poor horse goes through in the war. And so these women are literally pulling the plow themselves.
When the U.S. ended the war, the country suddenly needed large numbers of women as much as it needed soldiers. Whereas men were needed to fight in the trenches, women were needed as nurses, as translators, stenographers, and switchboard operators. Supplying the army with uniforms called thousands of seamstresses. Women enrolled in the army, navy, and even marines. Nurses volunteered in the Red Cross and YMCA. Sources reported that nearly 20,000 Red Cross nurses served in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, capital overseas. Female Salvation Army volunteers worked as nurses at the frontline canteen serving hot meals, donuts, and coffee to soldiers. Ordinary girls in towns all over England suddenly had a chance at a different life, the prospect of traveling to Europe to be an important part of the war effort. Among the thousands of women volunteering in France were many daughters of privilege.
A lot of your wealthy girls served.
Girls in elite women's institutions like Smith College often volunteered together. Newspapers like Stars and Stripes played up the society girls with bold headlines. Alice Scrubs Tubbs to aid U.S. February 1918 headline. Society girl wields brush and soap as her war weapons. The newspaper stories about rich girl volunteers were propaganda for sure. Also true. They weren't allowed to fight like their brothers in the Lafayette Escadrille.
That was a Air Force
The war gave
squadron.
them a chance for a bigger life. The Army head nurse wrote, "Some of the most conscientious and hardest workers in the unit are girls who had done nothing all their lives but fritter away their time in society. The war woke them up. And the girls of good education, they had never thought much about the stern realities of life until America got into the war, and they suddenly saw a chance to do something useful."
Some of the women acted as spies. In fact, there's the famous Mata Hari, who was a spy for the Germans against the French. She ultimately would be caught and she would be executed. There was an English nurse, Edith Clavell, who was believed to be helping English and French and Belgian soldiers, and she was executed by the Germans. So some of these women, y'all, paid with their lives for their work as well. Now, another, and then we've mentioned as well, like you saw from the video, nurses, a lot of these women. So a lot of these women, y'all, served as ambulance drivers as well. Here you see a British woman serving as an ambulance driver. That can be quite dangerous. Not only did women serve as ambulance drivers, but some Americans volunteered. And when we talked the other day, y'all, about the armistice, right? In November, I mentioned Ernest Hemingway, the great writer. I even mentioned Walt Disney, and both of these men, y'all, to their credit, volunteered even before America entered the war to go over and do their bit to help. I mean, imagine, y'all, if we'd lost Walt Disney in the war, our world would be quite different. Okay, and here's, of course, one of his cartoons that he drew, or a little kind of picture he drew, because even back then he was drawing pictures and stuff. Okay, now another thing AP loves to ask about is the war's impact on different ethnic groups. African Americans are ones that you often are asked to write about or to be aware about. Remember, that's a great way to go for that complexity point if you can differentiate the impact of various things. Now, in the Civil War, for the first time since the American Revolution, African Americans served, but there was a catch. They had to serve with white commanders. Now, if you've ever, and we'll talk more about that when I review and go over the Civil War, but you had groups like the famous 54th Massachusetts that served. The Marines did not allow African Americans in them to serve, okay? Now, there was an interesting impact, though, during this war. This is an example of what we call cultural diffusion. Now, a lot of these African Americans were musicians, particularly this one guy by the name of Hayward, y'all. He literally recruited some of the best jazz musicians in New York so that he would have the best band around. Now, as these men went overseas, a lot of them brought their jazz records. There was even something, y'all, called the trench phonograph that was small enough and light enough that you could take it and in the trenches play your music. Well, French soldiers, British soldiers, French civilians began to hear this American art form called jazz, and a big jazz age sweeps not just the United States after World War I. In fact, the 1920s, as we'll start looking at them Thursday and Friday, become known as the jazz age, but it sweeps through Europe. Now, the most famous of all African American units, if you're asked to talk about African American units in World War I, you will want to mention the Hellfighters or the Harlem Hellfighters because they fought like hell. And most of them were from the Harlem area, which is predominantly black in New York City. A lot of these guys, y'all, had been in gangs, they'd been street fighters, and they had a reputation of being very, very tough. And some of them distinguished themselves, winning all sorts of medals during the war. Now, what happens though, and this is something you can contrast with what happens in World War II. When they were over in Europe, the French, in a lot of ways, treated them as equals. The French valued them, whereas we tended to try to make a lot of them serve as cooks or chefs or ditch diggers and things like that. And the French treated them pretty well. French women treated them pretty well. And so when you're treated well for a while, you kind of forget maybe how you have been treated before. And when a lot of these guys returned, especially those that returned to the American South, they were not treated as well and were disappointed. Now, during World War II, a similar thing's going to happen. But the African American soldiers in World War II had kind of learned from the experience of their fathers. They made it clear that they were fighting for what they called the double V, victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism back home. And a lot of people really date the African American civil rights movement to basically World War II, with people like Jackie Robinson, who later became very famous as a baseball player. When he was at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, he was asked to give up his seat to an officer's wife. He refused to do so and was court-martialed. So you start seeing African Americans beginning to challenge their second-class status a lot more as a result of World War II because of what they had learned in World War I. Now, the thing is, too, it doesn't only impact African American soldiers, but African Americans as a whole also changed a great deal. Now, when I was here on Saturday, I talked about what's called the Sun Belt. Now, during World War II and the years after World War II, we have kind of the opposite thing happen. A lot of Northerners, whites and some blacks, began to move back to the South because during World War II, y'all, a lot of our bases, especially air bases, and a lot of our factories were located in the American South as well as the West. But in World War I, it was just the opposite. In World War I, your factories, most of them were up north. The South, y'all, was still largely agricultural. So in World War I, a lot of African Americans decided there are much better jobs up north. For example, Henry Ford began to offer all employees a minimum of $5 a day. Didn't matter what your race was. You did the work, you got $5 a day, which is probably equivalent today to around $100 or $90 a day, which was awfully good money for the folks back then. And enough African Americans moved to Detroit that they started calling it Motown for Motor Town because of the cars there. But you also saw large numbers of blacks moving to the north, like in New York. Chicago became another big area, a destination for them. And they wanted better jobs. They wanted to get away from their sharecropper type jobs they had in the American South, but also they were hoping to escape the racial Jim Crow laws, which, if you remember, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson made it legal to separate black men from white men and black women from white women in theaters and schools and places like that. Now, if they hoped that the North would not be racist, they were mistaken. It was racist in a lot of ways, just maybe not as clearly or as supported by law, but there were some differences. Now, we call this move up north the Great Migration, or sometimes called the Great Black Migration. And it's also going to pave a way, y'all, for a phenomenon we'll talk about in the 1920s called the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of African-American artists lived in Harlem, and their art, their music becomes known to a much, much wider audience. And that may have never happened had it not been for this Great Black Migration, really started during the war and continuing up until the Great Depression. Now, the thing is too, and I hope you guys can kind of understand this. This is kind of different. And I'll just give you guys a personal experience of my own. When I was a kid, I lived in Louisiana and I lived in Mississippi. I lived in Mississippi in 1969, 1970 there. I didn't go back to Mississippi for a lot of years, and I went back in the 80s. And I was really surprised to see how African Americans, a lot of them that I encountered, behaved differently towards whites. For example, and this was weird for me. I was a kid in college, but they would say, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," and act very, and I was like, wow, that kind of makes me feel kind of weird and uncomfortable. But Mississippi, y'all, had been one of the most racist and the toughest states for African Americans in this country. And to survive, they really kind of had to learn survival skills, how to act, how to avert your eyes from white women, for example, how to walk on the sidewalks differently. And it was part of what they had to do. Whereas up north, a lot of African Americans didn't have to do that. They didn't quite know how to, quote, how to behave. So what starts to happen during World War I is when we start gathering men to be in African American units, they start making their way down south to be trained here. Well, white Americans in the South expected the northern blacks to act like Southern blacks did, and you start having some conflicts and problems. And this is going to culminate in something happening in our own city. A lot of people in Houston aren't even aware of what became known as the Camp Logan Mutiny or the Camp Logan Riots. Now, Houston was a much, much smaller city then. We didn't even expand to where the Loop is today. There was no Loop. In fact, if you went out to like Wayside, y'all, you were out in the country. If you went to where Memorial Park is today, you were out in the country. So when we needed a place to train soldiers, we began having them work in this forested area that today is Memorial Park. It was called Camp Logan. Now, African-American units were brought there for training, and pretty soon conflicts began to happen. Now, what ends up happening, and we'll go over the causes of it, or I'll let you see a video in just a sec that shows you some of the causes of it. African-American soldiers riot. They grab their guns, they defy their white officers, and they go on a rampage downtown, shooting whites, killing some police officers particularly, And when it was all over, about 12 to 20 whites had died or been wounded. And ultimately, when this mutiny, as we called it, was put down, 40 black soldiers were charged with it. Some of them were undoubtedly guilty, right? But there were some that were just in the wrong place at the wrong time that had not shot anybody. But there was a real rush to justice. Now, these 40 men were taken to Fort Sam Houston, which is in San Antonio. They were given a very quick court martial. And when it was all said, 13 of them were hanged. Okay. Now, I'm just going to fast forward here a little bit through some of this. Let's see here.
Training. Local whites declared they would not stand for black soldiers, expecting to be treated as equals.
This was down in South Carolina.
The army went back to Camp Hill on Long Island, where the other converted units were training. Discrimination continued. Unit reached France. The commander of the American expedition, General Pershing, made it clear that these Negroes were going to be laborers. They could be chefs or dock workers. Black combat units were out of the question. Even though Pershing had commanded black troops before the war, politically he was urged not to anger white soldiers and the press.
Especially
The
Southerners.
army also insisted on strict orders that black troops were not to mix with French civilians. Not even a handshake in English. And to especially stay away from French work.
Ooh la la.
Most of the soldiers recoiled from months of dock workers. The U.S. Army didn't know what to do with them. The French did. By 1917, the French Army had practically bled to death. They had suffered nearly 1 million casualties, and there had been mutinies with the soldiers refusing to be sent into the slaughter. France already had non-white colonial troops on all borders of South Africa, from Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Vietnam. French soldiers accepted them as comrades in arms, even if they weren't considered equals in French society. They needed soldiers and did not care. 15th Heavy Foot became the 369th Regiment. The 369th were among the first American soldiers to fight in the trenches. They were in combat months before most of the U.S. Army. The French were impressed with their fighting. Maybe it's because the men were from the rough streets of New York, but observers saw something special about the Hellfighters. In close combat with bayonets and knives, they were unstoppable. The American press started changing its tune. One of the first combat heroes in the U.S. papers was Henry Johnson of the Hellfighters. Reportedly shot and attacked by a German platoon, Johnson was credited with killing at least 4 Germans with a knife and driving back the enemy. He was the first American soldier of any race to be awarded France's Croix de Guerre. Flattering pictures
War Cross.
of bravery and charisma started to replace those negative images seen in print just a year earlier. Many of these newspaper reporters started noting that the African American soldiers had the best spirits in the armed forces.
That's his gas mask.
It was noted by the French that one of the traits the Hellfighters brought was urban fighting. In a war of charges in the open space between trenches dug through poverty, the Harlemites specialized in fighting the Germans street by street in the towns and villages that the German army had captured and been fortified for years. It was recorded that during combat, the French general gave an order to retire. Colonel Hayward of the Hellfighters said, "My men never retire. They go forward or die, and they are going through here or heaven. You don't go back." At the end of the war,
Okay, so when they come back, they're given parades and things like we said, but things change. Now, we probably won't have time to see y'all packing up here, but I just want to mention some of the incidents that led to the Camp Logan riots, or the so-called Houston Mutiny of August 1917. As I said, there were African-American soldiers here, and they would go into town and things like that. Now, the Fourth Ward then, as it is today, was predominantly black. And a couple of young black kids were playing dice, right? They were shooting dice. And this police officer who had a reputation of being very anti-black, he chased these kids and he chased them into a house. Now the mother, or I don't know if she was the mother of them or whatever, the guy came in there. She was mad at him that he broke, came in through the house. She started yelling at him or whatever. Eventually, a black soldier nearby heard it. He came into her defense, and he got pistol whipped by these two particular Houston policemen. And then later, when this guy was taken, another black officer, this was actually a sergeant, I think, he was also beaten. Now, word reached the African-American soldiers that these men had died, that they had died of their wounds. It wasn't true. They'd been beaten, but fortunately, they had not died. But that's all that was needed. A lot of these men went and grabbed guns. They went onto the streets of Houston. They stopped cars. They shot people. They shot and killed like a young boy and wounded another one. They killed several police officers before this could be put down. But it obviously shows their anger at the situation at the time, and it's become famous. So if you're asked to talk about African Americans in World War I, to mention the Camp Logan riots would probably be a good thing. All right, that's it, y'all. Have a good day. All righty, so we're recording this. Hopefully it will come out okay to have for people who are absent or whatever, for posterity or my posterity. Anyway, thank you, Janelle, for laughing. It's one person in this classroom that got that. All right, so as I was mentioning yesterday, y'all, it's kind of natural that during a time of national peril or what we perceive to be peril, we see our government taking extra steps, things that we would have never believed that they would do. We've seen it during COVID. A lot of people believe the government has kind of overreached in some of its diktats or dictates to you and me about what we need to do, closing churches, schools, whatever. I don't know how history will look back at us for having done it that way. I mean, maybe it'll be understandable. We didn't know much about the disease. But during World War I, we had a definitely pretty crazy view of what the German threat was. Now, I would agree, World War II, yeah, the Germans were really that serious a threat, but we kind of went overboard, in my personal opinion anyway, with our characterization of the Germans as just absolutely barbarians, okay? So we used artists. We used people like that to do anti-German, pro-American propaganda. We also used the 4-Minute Men. This was, of course, harking back to the days when we had Minutemen during the American Revolution. These were American volunteers who allegedly in a minute could be ready to fight. Well, I guess these guys needed 4 minutes. And in that 4 minutes, y'all, they could explain why we were fighting the war. They had to be listened to. Most commonly, they spoke at movie theaters, but they could stop you on the street like, sir, do you know why we're fighting this war? Well, yeah, I do. Well, let me tell you, and they would go into the spiel. And you really had to listen to them or you might be perceived as anti-patriotic. Here's just a little brief. I don't think we saw this video yesterday, did we? Yeah. We did see it. Okay, cool. So I don't have to show that. All right. So we really kind of go overboard, y'all. And this is something you guys can always kind of expect whenever we have, like I say, this kind of moment of national peril. Now, in World War II, there's going to be some anti-German feelings, but nothing compared to the anti-Japanese hysteria of World War II. In World War I, by the way, the Japanese were an ally, okay? Now, the American Protective League is formed, and this American Protective League, y'all, was basically kind of volunteers. I guess we kind of call them Karens today, so to speak, whose job was to go out there and catch people doing wrong things, catch people saying unpatriotic things, spy on teachers, and all kinds of things like that. Now, they helped an organization called the Bureau of Investigation, and its young leader, J. Edgar Hoover. And that organization would ultimately morph into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. So the FBI has its birth, y'all, in basically, World War I kind of hysteria. Now, to be honest, there were German spies here. We caught them. They were legit spies here. There were also real German saboteurs who did try to blow up or mess up some of our factories, y'all. And so as always, there was a little bit of truth there, but people took it, to another degree. Kind of like the same thing with the second Red Scare. There were communists in the U.S. military. There were communists in Hollywood and in our diplomatic, departments and stuff like that. But of course, people took it and exaggerated that fear and used it. Now, they really mounted an anti-German thing. You got to remember, y'all, after English and Irish people, German people were our biggest immigrants in this community or in this country. And for example, you saw people smashing the windows, trashing the businesses of some German Americans. Some of those people, y'all, had been here, their families had been here for 80 years or more since the 1840s or so. And so you saw that. And, I hate to say it, but there's even been some reports, fortunately very few, of some Americans attacking Russian American businesses. One of the most ironic was a guy serves Russian food and has a Russian restaurant because it's better known, but he's a Ukrainian guy. And people canceled things and they smashed or they painted on his windows. So we're not immune to this kind of hysteria, and it's sad, but people do it. Kind of ironic, yeah. Now, if you think that's bad, we actually banned our orchestras from playing Beethoven. Yeah, no more Ludwig van. I mean, can you imagine? That's like half of the good classical music. Yeah. And then we banned this guy too, Bach, right? No more Brandenburg concertos. One of my all-time favorite pieces of music. Now, Mozart was okay because he's Austrian. And we didn't hate the Austrians as much. So yeah, no Bach, sorry. Yep. Now, believe it or not, some German foods were renamed. This is where it gets crazy, y'all. Crazy talk. Sauerkraut, one of the bad names you could call a German was a kraut because they liked eating kraut so much. And this is sauerkraut. If you've never seen it, I hope I never see it again. I hate that stuff. Oh. It's cabbage and vinegar. Yeah. Two great things that don't go great together. You like it? My wife grows it, and see, I don't like coleslaw either. So those of you that do, more power to you. I will, if we ever find ourselves at a restaurant together, I will share my sauerkraut and cabbage and coleslaw with y'all. Okay? We should. I would love that, right? Y'all will make it just because of that. Like, Mr. D, I brought sauerkraut for everybody. Sauerkraut was renamed, y'all, Liberty cabbage.
Liberty cabbage?
Hey, can I have some of that Liberty cabbage? German measles became Liberty measles. You would think, if all things, we'd give the Germans their measles, right? Like, hey, that's a bad thing, right? So call it after the Germans. Instead of chicken pox, call it German pox, whatever. But they changed it, I guess, to Liberty measles, which I guess makes you feel better. I had the German measles as a kid, y'all, and it was miserable. You can go blind. Now, hamburgers, which, I guess is the name of an inhabitant of Hamburg. They're a hamburger, literally. There's a nice hamburger. Look at that. Look at the size of that hamburger. That hamburger's huge. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. So if you guys have to talk about kind of hysteria, context of it, pretty silly stuff, right, to do that. Now, lest you think that we're immune to this, back when the French didn't support us in this air raid against Libya back in the day, y'all, there were Americans who got so mad at the French.
How mad did they get?
How mad did they get? Thank you, Oscar. That they renamed French fries Patriot fries. It did really. So I dare you at lunch today, like, hey, do you have any of those Patriot fries? Like, no, we got us French ones. So I don't want those. But so it's not, it's kind of crazy how weird people get. Now, beer. Now, when you think of beer besides Germany, besides Ireland, my great-great-grandparents' home, you think of Germany, right? Germany invented the style of beer known as lager beer. It's made in caves, or at least it used to be. That's what lager means. And it's one type of beer. The other type of beer is ale, right? Which is done differently. Well, most Americans, Budweiser, Busch, all those companies, y'all, made German-style lager beer. That became unpatriotic. You're drinking German beer. You're keeping barley. You're keeping wheat. You're keeping all that stuff from our soldiers. And this is going to be the final nail in the coffin, y'all, for alcohol. And it's going to lead to the passing of the 18th Amendment, which is going to ban the manufacture, the transportation, or the sale of alcohol. And that didn't get changed until 1933. So from 1918 to 1933, it was banned. And in fact, some places like Maine was the first state to ban it. But nationally, even if your state didn't vote for it, y'all, once you got 3/4 of the states to agree to it, it became the law for all the other quarter states, whether they wanted it or not. Go ahead.
It still got produced though, right? Obviously.
Well, they did in little bits. Like, for example, we needed it for church services to make wine. A lot of people went to church. They also made it for some medicinal purposes, and they could make kind of like a very light beer. But people still made it at home. It's like, it's against the law to have drugs, so we don't have drugs, right? Yeah, right? People are still going to do it. If there's a demand for it, and people are going to do it. And what it did, y'all, it caused organized crime to really flourish and become a national problem because people still wanted the alcohol. And so it happened. Do what, Oscar?
Did a black market like a rise?
Yeah, it created a black market for it, sadly, like there is for drugs, right? Now, some Germans, y'all, had to go so far as to change their name so they wouldn't get grief. So, like, let's say your name was Schmidt. You would legally change it to Smith. Maybe your name was Brown, B-R-A-U-N. It became Brown, right? Felt became Filled. All these different changes because your name just sounded that. If you think that's kind of crazy, the king and queen of England, y'all, their family was the House of Battenberg, which was a German house. So they changed their name during World War I to the House of Windsor. And that's where that comes from because it sounded too German. And some of the Battenbergs changed their name to like Mountbatten because Berg in German means mountain. And so it happened in England too, but especially among the royals. All right, now probably the lowest moment came with the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. We didn't really talk a whole lot about it, although I plan to on Thursday. Under President Adams, the first Adams, we had passed something called the Alien and Sedition Act. Now, most aliens, and by them I don't mean the guy that has the acid spit and everything and has the big head. I'm talking about immigrants, right? Y'all seen Alien, right? Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure. But anyway, aliens as an immigrant. Under Adams, y'all, it became much, much harder to become an American citizen. Why did they do that? Because most immigrants were voting for his opponent, Jefferson, and his Democratic Republican Party. And so they wanted to keep them from getting the vote. And so they did that. Also, under the Sedition Act, it became illegal under Adams to criticize the government. Now, we had the Bill of Rights already, y'all, but the Supreme Court didn't yet have the power of judicial review to strike down laws that were unconstitutional. And that was considered sort of the low point. Now, as I'd said before too, y'all, during the Civil War, even Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. Your right to be basically informed of the charge against you. And he had people jailed who had the wrong political beliefs. I hate to say that about my favorite president, but he really felt like he had to do this or he might lose Maryland to the Confederacy. So he arrested a bunch of pro-secessionist journalists and politicians. Okay, come to World War I. We're very, very worried. And we made it illegal for criticizing the government's war policy. Now, you can criticize the government. You could say nasty stuff about Wilson all you wanted. But what you couldn't do is criticize the fact that we were in the war and how we were fighting the war. And if you did anything that was considered rebellion, or sedition. Sedition is when you go against the government, and you try to hurt the government in some way, you could go to jail. And the biggest way to do this, y'all, was to criticize or try to find some way to obstruct the draft. Now, this wasn't just one of those feel-good laws that sometimes are passed and not enforced. This was enforced on a few people. Eventually, 2,000 people were prosecuted, and half of them actually did jail time under this act. Now, like I said, there was a real threat of real espionage. Germans had agents here, either imported from Germany or Americans who were of German background who agreed to help their former country. So there was some of that. But once again, we always get, and a great word for you guys to know if you don't know it yet, one that people love to hear is overzealous. It looks like jealous, but it's with the Z. If you're overzealous, you go too far, right? You're a little too excited about it. And this statue, or this cartoon, I should say, really kind of reveals a lot of people's fear about this overzealousness of this bill, which became a law. Obviously, what's happening in this picture? Liberty's light is being taken, the Statue of Liberty, right? Her official name is Liberty Enlightening the World. They even have it down here in case like you don't know what Liberty is. The Statue of Liberty, there she is. She's even looking kind of downcast, kind of sad, right? Maybe she does that in real life, I don't know. But anyway, so what is stealing her lamp? The espionage bill. So basically, freedom, y'all, liberty is being taken away. And it says, must liberty's light go out? This was a real fear. And obviously, this person's point of view would be somebody very opposed to the Espionage Act, opposed to the abuse of civil liberties that happen so often. If you had this on a test, y'all, this would be a great way for y'all to get some historical situation by maybe mentioning other times that this has happened, or this is something, that happens in wartime, and you could even connect it to Japanese Americans in World War II, maybe being, interned for, during the war. Now, once again, the last time we'll probably hear Eugene Debs. It seems like we've been talking about him for half the year. Remember, he had been the founder, the leader of America's Socialist Party. He had started out as just a labor leader, but when the Pullman strike was crushed by the military in Illinois, he went to jail. And in jail, he was radicalized like a lot of people are, like Fidel Castro. When he went to jail, y'all, he became a Marxist. Hitler, when he went to jail, well, he became a Nazi in a lot of ways. Well, he was already a Nazi, but even more devout. Which is, as I told y'all, that's how Germans tie their shoes, right? They're little Nazis.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, what's their favorite number? 9. Sorry, I'll be here all week. Next week too, probably. Okay, so anyway, but Eugene Debs got thrown into jail, y'all, for 10 years. Now, ironically, a conservative Republican president, Warren G. Harding, let him out early as sort of basically, he was old and they thought he wasn't a threat anymore. But still, while he was in jail, y'all, in 1916, or was it 16? No, 1920, I guess he was still in jail. He ran for president. And, that's kind of ironic because usually, y'all, our politicians are elected first, then they go to jail later. His idea was, hey, why don't I reverse that? I go to jail now, and then I get elected to an office. I'm already there, right? And I have a campaign button somewhere from the Eugene Debs Society, and it's got basically a picture of him in jail with the bars, and it says, vote for, and then it has his prison number on it. I love it. It's hilarious. But he does get let out. So he is probably the most famous victim of it. But the case you guys absolutely positively have to know for STAR test, and it wouldn't hurt you to know for AP test, is Skank or Shank. You hear different pronunciations, Schnick, whatever. Just know roughly how it's spelled, versus the United States. Now, this all happened during the war, but it took a while for it to make its way to the USSC, that is, the United States Supreme Court case. Now, in this case, Schneck, who was basically accused, y'all, of distributing anti-draft pamphlets, telling people why they shouldn't support the draft, how they could avoid the draft, he was arrested and charged with sedition, right, for trying to hurt the country's war effort. And like I said, he went to jail, he appealed, and eventually it reaches the Supreme Court. Now, this case is still relevant today. It is still in use today. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? Normally a fairly liberal, enlightened kind of justice. He set what's become known as the clear and present danger test, or the clear and present danger doctrine. Now, what he basically said is your right to free speech, your right to free press is not absolute. The government has the right to make some common sense limits on it. And the example he used was freedom of speech does not allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, right? Obviously, if there's a fire, y'all in a theater, yell it, please. But if there isn't a fire, don't yell it, because what's going to happen? People going to panic, right? People going to get hurt. Yeah, it's going to be awful. I mean, it's going to be like a panic at the disco or something. But anyway, and so here's a Tom Clancy movie and book called Clear and Present Danger, where we invoked that and we actually invaded Colombia trying to stop the drug trade. Didn't go very well. But anyway, this doctrine is still there today. So before a person's freedom of speech can be abridged, we have to consider what they're doing is very clear that it's a danger and that it's a present danger. It's like immediately a thing. And of course, one of the big arguments now is, does hate speech constitute a clear and present danger? Because there are people that say it can be banned. Other people say, no, it doesn't constitute that clear and present danger. And it's one of the things that y'all's generation is going to have to work out and kind of settle, okay? Some people say, like, hate speech, for example, right? You know, where you say nasty stuff that inflames people, gets people upset. But where do you draw the line? What if it merely hurts somebody's feeling? Should that be banned? You know, there has to be, some setup to it. Otherwise, free speech is going to disappear, right? Now, the next thing to know, this is more for STAR, but it definitely will help you guys if you have to write about this stuff in AP. Here's some basic people that you guys need to know that could appear on your STAR test as well as on the AP test. Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a progressive president. He was technically a Democrat, but he followed the progressive views. He's the president that brings us the income tax. He's the president who creates the Federal Reserve Board. Now, remember, he had been, quote, a minority president. By that, I don't mean he's a minority. I mean, he got elected by a but a non-majority of the population, kind of like Lincoln did in his first term. Why did that happen? Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had been out of the presidency for 4 years, but Teddy had gotten very, very nervous about what Taft was doing. He thought Taft was breaking up too many large corporations. He distrusted Taft on a lot of things, who'd been one of his best friends. And so Teddy decides to run. But the Republicans aren't going to dump their current, president, right? They've got a president sitting in the White House. And so the Republicans refuse to nominate Teddy. So Teddy, being Teddy, decides to create his own party called the Progressive Party, but everybody knows it as the Bull Moose Party. What does that do? That splits the Republican votes. I mean, imagine, y'all, if Biden and Sanders had both run as separate candidates against Trump. Trump would have won, right? Because the Democrats would have split their votes. Same thing basically happened, y'all, with Republicans in 1912. And so Wilson, y'all, becomes the only Democratic president after 1892 all the way until 1932, y'all, to get elected. And he would have never gotten elected had it not been for the split in the Republican Party. Now, he was very much an idealistic person. We also know now he was also very racist, even kind of by the standards of their time. I don't like to judge people by our standards. I don't think that's necessarily fair, because I don't want to be judged by people's standards 100, 200 years from now. But even African Americans had a problem back then with this guy and some of his beliefs. He'd been raised a Southerner. He had good things to say about the Klan, for example. He allowed The Birth of Nation to be the first movie shown in the White House. And yet at the same time, he was a scholar. He was a college professor of Princeton, no less, y'all. And as an idealistic person who did try to look and think of government as absolutely good and could do great things for everybody, he really thought that he could convince Europeans who'd been killing each other for 2 or 3 years to have peace without victory. That basically he could talk the British and the French and the Germans to just all go home and shake hands and be buds again. I mean, it was very idealistic, and it's sad, y'all, but during a war, in some ways, the longer a war goes on, the harder it can be to get peace. Not because people aren't exhausted and want out of it, but because so much has already been lost. When you've lost millions of men and billions of dollars, you want something to show for it, for the loss of your blood and treasure. And the British and French were like, homie, don't play that. We're not going to do that. And so his attempt to get peace with victory was a failure. He even sent one of his best friends, a Texan by the name of Colonel House, Edward House. He sent him over to Europe to try to sit down with the British and the French and the Germans to bring about the end of the war. I say all this, y'all, because you kind of need to know of his idealism, right? This guy really thought, he could use his brain as a good progressive. He could use his brain to solve all the problems of the world. Now, in 1916, he runs again. And remember, he had really barely won in 1912. In 1916, it looks like he might be defeated by Charles Evans Hughes, a kind of moderate Republican. But his slogan is what won him the election. His slogan was, he kept us out of war, or he has kept us out of war. I actually have one of those pins somewhere. I never can find the stuff I need when I need it, but when I don't need it, it's always around. But anyway, this was what got him elected. Basically, he made it look like if you voted for the other guy, you'd be going to war. Nevertheless, even after he won this, and by the way, the election was so close. Very good. Man, y'all are learning. It was so close that Charles Evans Hughes went to bed thinking he had won. Wilson went to bed thinking he had lost and woke up in the morning to find out he had just got it by that much. Okay? Now, however, within 5 months of the election, April 1917, he does ask Congress to go to war. And, a lot of people accuse him of being sort of a hypocrite, like, oh, he gets reelected, so now he took us into war. Remember the events that happened, y'all. The Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant American ships were going to be sunk, American sailors and merchantmen were going to die. Also, remember, the Zimmerman telegram comes out in February of 1917, which basically says, look, they're trying to get Mexico to attack us. So I really don't think he had any choice but to go and ask Congress. And remember, being this idealistic guy he was, this wasn't going to be a war about territorial gain or a war about, conquering, an enemy and getting revenge. It was a war to get rid of the tyranny and to make the world safe for democracy. Very idealistic guy in this case. And that's why before I knew about his racism, he was kind of a hero of mine in high school. Okay. Now, of course, knowing a lot of the other stuff about him, I still kind of admire his idealism. All of us, when we're young, should be kind of idealistic. Sadly, as you get older, you get kind of jaded and you don't have that idealism. But he still had it. He's also the author of the 14 Points, which he puts out in January of 1918 to basically tell the Germans, look, if you stop fighting now, this is going to be the basis of the peace treaty. And to the Germans, it seemed pretty fair, although they waited another 10 months before they finally did surrender. So Wilson, you should know that. The other thing about him, y'all, he is the father of this League of Nations. You can also say indirectly, he's the father of the United Nations. And literally, y'all, he will give up his life trying to get the American people to pressure their senators to vote for the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. How did he give up his life? He was traveling around the country, y'all, tirelessly campaigning for this. And in Pueblo, Colorado, he just fainted. He passed out. And shortly thereafter, he had a stroke. And he was never, ever able to talk or do much again. for the last year of his presidency, and he died a broken man. So, you know, he believed in it. He gave up everything for it and still didn't get it. Now, the next guy to talk about is John Pershing. Pershing, y'all, was in charge of what was called the AEF. Now, Pershing had a lot of military experience. He had fought in the Spanish-American War alongside Teddy Roosevelt in the charge up San Juan Hill, and he commanded what were called colored troops in those days. Remember, African Americans had white officers, and that's where he earned the name Black Jack Pershing. We'll go ahead and stop there, y'all.